The Ravenclaw raiders thought they owned the rugged canyon lands of Arizona. For 5 years, they'd built their criminal empire through rustling, extortion, and violent land seizures, leaving behind desperate families and shattered futures wherever they rode. But on a moonless summer night, beneath the looming shadows of the Serpent Spine Mountains, they made a fatal miscalculation that would haunt the territories for generations to come. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The scorching afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the parched Arizona landscape, casting long shadows across the golden brown earth. Dust devils danced across the valley floor, twisting skyward before disappearing as quickly as they had formed. The relentless heat had turned the land brittle, cracking the soil and withering all but the hardiest of desert plants. Most creatures had sought shelter from the punishing rays, hiding in burrows or beneath the sparse shade of mesquite trees and towering saguaro cacti. But Eliana Blackwood wasn't most creatures. She moved through the barren terrain with practiced silence, her lean frame perfectly balanced as she navigated the treacherous slope. At 47, her face weathered by years under the southwestern sun, she possessed the patient stillness of a born predator. Her dark hair, streaked with silver, was pulled back in a tight braid that hung between her shoulder blades. Eyes, the color of burnished copper, scanned the rocky outcropping above, searching for signs of her quarry. The mountain lion had been terrorizing ranches across Vermilion County for weeks. 3 calves and a prize stallion had fallen victim to its hunger already. The territorial male, driven from its usual hunting grounds by drought and wildfires, had grown desperate and bold. When the county sheriff had put out a call for experienced hunters, most had arrived with rifles and tracking dogs. Eliana had come with only her knife, a 12-inch blade of Damascus steel that hung at her hip, and the tracking skills that had made her a legend among the Apache who had taught her their ways. She froze as a small cascade of pebbles tumbled down the canyon wall 30 yards ahead. There, poised on a natural shelf of red sandstone, stood her prey. The mountain lion's tawny coat blended nearly perfectly with the surrounding rocks, but Eliana's trained eyes had caught the flick of its tail. The big cat was massive, easily 200 pounds of pure muscle, topped by powerful jaws that could crush a deer's spine with a single bite. For most, the sight would inspire terror. For Eliana, it kindled respect and a familiar surge of adrenaline. She had tracked and killed 17 mountain lions in her lifetime, each confrontation a sacred dance between equals. Her Apache mentors had taught her that to hunt the lion with only a blade was to truly honor its spirit, to place yourself on equal footing with nature's perfect predator. The cat hadn't noticed her yet. Eliana remained motionless, controlling her breathing until it became imperceptible. The hunt would require perfect timing and positioning. She would need to approach from below, using the terrain to limit the animal's escape routes. One mistake, one snapped twig or dislodged stone would alert the predator to her presence and potentially transform her from hunter to prey. As the afternoon wore on, Eliana patiently closed the distance. The mountain lion moved higher into the canyon, unaware of the human shadow that tracked its every movement. When the cat finally settled on a broad ledge to rest in the late afternoon heat, Eliana made her move. With the silence of wind-blown sand, she scaled the canyon wall, her fingers finding invisible holds in the seemingly smooth rock face. The confrontation, when it came, was swift and violent. The mountain lion detected her presence mere seconds before she reached its perch, its muscles bunching as it prepared to spring. Eliana met its charge with calculated precision, pivoting at the last possible moment to avoid the slashing claws. While bringing her knife to bear, the dance that followed was brutal and primal, flesh and blade against tooth and claw. 2 minutes later, Eliana stood over the fallen predator, blood seeping from 3 parallel gashes across her left shoulder. She knelt beside the magnificent creature, placing a hand on its cooling flank. "Your spirit is free," she whispered in the Apache tongue. "Your strength becomes mine. Your eyes will guide me through darkness." Following tradition, she harvested the claws and canine teeth, not as trophies, but as sacred objects that contained the animal's power. From its pelt, she would later create a ceremonial cloak that would serve as both protection and reminder of the balance between life and death. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Eliana made her way back down the canyon, her steps sure despite her injury. The county would pay the bounty, but the true value of the hunt lay in what she had gained and what she had honored. The lion's spirit would join those of the others she had faced, a council of predators that guided her path through this harsh and beautiful land. 3 hours later, as stars began to pepper the darkening sky, Eliana approached her ranch. Shadow Valley, they called it. 500 acres of hardscrabble land nestled in a protected valley flanked by imposing cliffs on 3 sides. It wasn't the richest soil or the easiest terrain, but over 15 years, she and her husband Marcus had transformed it into something special. The pain in her shoulder had settled into a dull throb by the time the ranch house came into view. The modest 2-story structure was built from local stone and timber, designed to withstand both the punishing summer heat and the occasional harsh winter. Solar panels glinted on the roof, a modern addition that Marcus had insisted upon, despite the considerable expense. "The future," he'd said, "is learning to live with the land, not just on it." As Eliana approached, a figure emerged from the front porch, backlit by the warm glow of lanterns. Helena Red Sky, her foreman's 20-year-old daughter, rushed toward her with evident concern. "Mrs. Blackwood, we were getting worried." The young woman stopped short when she noticed the bloodstains on Eliana's buckskin shirt. "You're hurt!" "It's nothing serious," Eliana replied, her voice calm. "The cat got in one good swipe before the end. Where's your father?" Dad rode out to the north pasture with Miguel and Thomas. "There's trouble with the water pump again, and with this drought." Helena shook her head. "He said not to expect them back until morning." Eliana nodded, unsurprised. Joseph Redbird had been her foreman for 12 years, and his dedication to Shadow Valley matched her own. The ongoing drought had strained every ranch in the territory, forcing them to dig deeper wells and implement increasingly complex irrigation systems just to keep their cattle alive. Inside the ranch house, Helena helped clean and dress Eliana's wounds. The young woman had a healer's touch, gentle yet efficient. Her Navajo grandmother had taught her traditional medicine, which she combined with modern first aid knowledge gained during a year of nursing school, before family obligations had called her home. "That's the 3rd mountain lion you've taken with just your knife," Helena said, as she applied a poultice of yarrow and sage to the gashes. "The men in town talk about it like you're some kind of spirit walker." A faint smile crossed Eliana's weathered features. "Men talk, the land listens, only one conversation matters." After Helena had finished with the bandages, Eliana retreated to her study, a room filled with books on everything from agriculture to zoology, interspersed with artifacts from her many journeys. On the wall hung an old cavalry sword that had belonged to her grandfather, alongside a traditional Apache bow gifted to her by White Feather, the elder who had first recognized her affinity for the old ways. She placed the mountain lion's canines in a cedar box on her desk, alongside others she had collected over the decades. Each represented a lesson, a moment of perfect connection between predator and prey, hunter and hunted. The boundaries between those roles had always seemed fluid to Eliana, especially after her time living with the Apache following her parents' death in a flash flood when she was just 16. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. As night deepened, Helena moved to the back porch, settling into a handcrafted rocking chair that Marcus had made for their 10th anniversary. From this vantage point, she could see the entirety of the main ranch compound, the bunkhouse where the hands stayed, the large barn with its attached workshop, the corrals where they broke the occasional wild mustang, and beyond, the pastures, where their modest herd of drought-resistant Corriente cattle grazed. The ranch wasn't large by Arizona standards, but it was sustainable, and, more importantly, it was hers. After Marcus had died from pancreatic cancer 3 years ago, many had expected her to sell and move to town. Instead, she had doubled down, implementing innovative water conservation techniques and focusing on quality over quantity in their breeding program. Shadow Valley had not just survived, but had begun to thrive, even as other ranches folded under the pressure of corporate buyouts and environmental challenges. The success had not gone unnoticed. For the past 8 months, representatives from Crimson Ridge Development had been showing up with increasingly generous offers to purchase her land. Their plans to build a luxury resort and golf course would require her water rights and access road. Each time Helena had sent them away with the same answer. Shadow Valley wasn't for sale at any price. 2 weeks ago, the nature of their approach had changed. Victor Ravenclaw himself had come calling, his black Cadillac Escalade kicking up dust clouds visible from miles away. The notorious businessman's reputation preceded him. Rumors of strong-arm tactics, bribed officials, and mysterious accidents that befell those who stood in his way. He'd founded the Ravenclaw Raiders Motorcycle Club decades ago, before legitimizing his operations through real estate development and casinos. But the outlaw attitude remained, now cloaked in expensive suits and legal documents. "Mrs. Blackwood," he'd said, his voice smooth as aged whiskey despite his imposing frame, "I respect a woman who knows the value of what she has. But you should understand that progress is inevitable. The question isn't if this valley will be developed, but when and by whom." Helena had met his gaze without flinching. "Mr. Ravenclaw, I respect a man who speaks his mind. So let me be equally clear. This land has been paid for in blood and sweat, mine and my husband's. It will remain as we built it, for as long as I draw breath." His smile hadn't reached his eyes. "I admire your spirit truly, but consider this, a courtesy call. My final offer is triple market value, paid immediately. After today, the offer expires, and things tend to get complicated. Is that a threat, Mr. Ravenclaw?" "Merely an observation about the challenges of ranching these days. Drought, equipment failures, accidents. It's a dangerous business for anyone, let alone a widow operating alone." After he'd left, Helena had called Sheriff Tanner, but the conversation had left her cold. "I can't arrest a man for making an observation, Helena," the sheriff had said, his discomfort evident even over the phone. "Besides, Ravenclaw hasn't been directly tied to anything illegal in years. His developments bring jobs and tax revenue the county desperately needs." The memory of that conversation still burned as Helena rocked gently on the porch, watching. The stars wheel overhead. Something was coming. She could feel it in her bones, the same way she sensed changes in the weather or the presence of a predator in her territory. The distant sound of approaching vehicles broke through her thoughts. Headlights appeared on the access road, at least 3 sets cutting through the darkness where there should be none. No one from the ranch would be returning tonight, and visitors never came this late without calling ahead. Helena rose from her chair, moving silently into the house. From a cabinet near the back door, she retrieved an old Winchester rifle, a precaution rather than her preferred tool. As she checked that it was loaded, her mind catalogued potential scenarios and responses. This wasn't her first confrontation, and Shadow Valley had always attracted those who mistook isolation for vulnerability. Positioning herself in the shadows of the porch, Eliana watched as 3 black SUVs pulled into the ranch yard. The vehicles formed a half-circle, headlights illuminating the front of the house like a stage. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, simultaneously, all doors opened. 8 men emerged, their features obscured by the backlighting. Most wore dark clothing that blended with the night. But one figure stood out, a tall man in an expensive suit that gleamed faintly in the vehicle lights. Victor Ravenclaw. "Mrs. Blackwood," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "I apologize for the late hour, but business opportunities wait for no one. I've brought the paperwork for our arrangement." Eliana remained silent, observing. 4 of the men carried obvious weapons, handguns holstered at their sides. 2 others held what appeared to be gasoline canisters. The remaining man beside Ravenclaw had clutched a leather portfolio. "I know you're there, Mrs. Blackwood," Ravenclaw continued, his tone hardening. "My patience, unlike my offers, has limits." Eliana stepped forward into the light, the Winchester held casually but visibly at her side. "There is no arrangement, Mr. Ravenclaw. I believe I made that clear during your last visit." Ravenclaw's smile was predatory. "Circumstances have changed. You see, I've acquired the mortgage on Shadow Valley from Vermilion County Bank. Economics, pressures, management changes. You understand how these things go. As the new lien holder, I'm exercising my right to call in the loan immediately." "My mortgage was paid in full 3 years ago," Eliana replied, her voice steady despite the rage building inside her. "I have the documentation. Documentation can be lost, records corrupted." Ravenclaw spread his hands in a gesture of false sympathy. "It's unfortunate, but the legal paperwork clearly shows an outstanding balance of $457,000. Unless you can produce that sum by morning, this property will be forfeit." The brazenness of the lie was breathtaking, but not surprising. Eliana had heard stories of similar tactics used against other holdouts in the region. What made her blood run cold was the confidence with which Ravenclaw delivered his ultimatum. He wouldn't be here taking such risks unless he had the local authorities in his pocket. "And if I refuse to acknowledge this fictional debt?" she asked, already knowing the answer. Ravenclaw's smile widened. "Then we would be forced to reclaim the property through more direct means. Insurance would cover any unfortunate accidents, of course. Electrical fires are so common in these old ranch houses." As if on cue, the men with gasoline canisters took a step forward. Time seemed to slow for Eliana. She could feel her heartbeat steady and strong, could sense the night air against her skin, could smell the unique combination of dust, sage and pine that defined Shadow Valley. In that moment of perfect clarity, she made her decision. "I need to retrieve my husband's papers from the safe," she said, keeping her voice neutral. "They'll prove the mortgage was satisfied." Ravenclaw nodded, clearly believing he had won. "Of course. Ramirez, accompany Mrs. Blackwood inside. The rest of you remain alert." One of the armed men detached from the group, following Eliana into the house. As she led him through the darkened living room toward her study, she felt the familiar calm that preceded action. The mountain lion's spirit seemed to whisper in her ear, guiding her movements as she navigated the familiar space. In the study, Eliana moved to the antique roll-top desk where Marcus had kept their important documents. The man called Ramirez stood in the doorway, hand resting on his holstered weapon, watching her with the bored expression of someone performing a routine task. "It's in the hidden compartment," Eliana explained, pulling out the desktop organizer to reveal a small safe built into the structure. Marcus was always paranoid about keeping our papers secure. As she worked the combination, positioning her body to shield her movements, Eliana continued speaking in a conversational tone. You know, my husband always said a person's true character is revealed in how they treat those weaker than themselves. Ramirez grunted, uninterested. I found that to be true, she continued, feeling the safe's mechanism click into place. But I've also found that people often make dangerous assumptions about who is weak and who is strong. The safe door swung open. Instead of papers, Eliana's hand closed around the hilt of her hunting knife, the same blade that had tasted mountain, lion blood just hours earlier. What happened next occurred with such speed that Ramirez had no time to react. Eliana moved with the fluid grace of a lifetime spent in perfect awareness of her body and surroundings. The knife slashed outward, catching Ramirez across the wrist as he belatedly reached for his weapon. Before he could shout, Eliana was behind him, one hand clamped over his mouth, the blade now pressed against his throat. Not a sound, she whispered, her voice carrying the cold certainty of the grave. Nod, if you understand. The man nodded frantically, blood dripping from his wounded wrist onto the hardwood floor. Good. Now we're going to walk outside together. You will say nothing unless I tell you to speak. One wrong word, one suspicious movement, and you'll join the mountain lions whose territories you've invaded. The knife pressed slightly harder, drawing a thin line of blood. Nod again. Another desperate nod. Outside, Ravenclaw and his men were growing restless. 7 minutes had passed since Eliana and Ramirez had entered the house. One of the men with a gasoline canister had begun pacing, while Ravenclaw checked his watch with increasing frequency. When the front door finally opened, all eyes turned expectantly toward the porch. What they saw froze them in place. Eliana emerged first, moving with predatory confidence. Behind her came Ramirez, his face pale with shock and fear, a thin line of blood visible on his throat just above the knife blade Eliana held in place with practiced ease. It seems we have a misunderstanding, Mr. Ravenclaw, Eliana called out, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. Your man and I have had an illuminating conversation about the true nature of your visit tonight. Ravenclaw's composed facade cracked momentarily before he regained control. This is unnecessary, Mrs. Blackwood. Release my associate, and we can discuss this like reasonable people. I think we're past reasonable discussion, Eliana replied. You came to burn my home and steal my land. The time for talking ended when you filled those canisters with gasoline. The men with weapons had spread out, seeking clear lines of fire, but the darkness beyond the headlights' reach made them hesitant. They couldn't be certain where Eliana might move, or if she had allies hidden in the surrounding buildings. Think carefully about what you're doing, Ravenclaw warned, his voice hardening. This ends one way. You're outnumbered and outgunned. Even if you harm Ramirez, the outcome remains the same. Eliana's laugh was soft, but carried a razor's edge. Numbers mean little in the dark, Mr. Ravenclaw, and guns require targets. Her free hand moved to a switch on the porch wall. Let me show you something my Apache friends taught me about night hunting. The ranch floodlights went dark, plunging the yard into sudden, complete darkness. The only illumination came from the SUV's headlights, which now created perfect backlighting for Ravenclaw and his men, while leaving Eliana an invisible presence in the blackness beyond. In the confusion that followed, the night erupted into chaos. A strangled cry came from somewhere to the left. One of the armed men fired blindly, the muzzle flash momentarily illuminating nothing but empty space. Ravenclaw shouted orders that went unheeded, as his men, accustomed to being the predators rather than the prey, found themselves disoriented and vulnerable. One by one, the headlights of the SUVs went out, each accompanied by the sound of braking. At glass, with each lost light source, the darkness grew more complete, the advantage shifting further in Eliana's favor. What the hell is happening? Someone shouted, panic evident in their voice. A bone-chilling whistle cut through the night, an Apache hunting call that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Then another, seemingly from the opposite direction. "She's not alone," one of the men yelled. "There's more of them out there." Ravenclaw, maintaining his position near the central SUV, pulled a handgun from inside his jacket. "Hold your positions," he commanded. "She's playing mind games. It's one woman against 7 of us." But his men were already breaking ranks, firing at shadows and imagined movements in the darkness. From the corner of his eye, Ravenclaw saw one of his men crumple silently to the ground. Then another staggered backward, clutching his leg. The night had transformed into a hunting ground, and they were no longer the hunters. The first light of dawn revealed the aftermath of the night's confrontation. 3 black SUVs remained in the ranch yard, their tires slashed, headlights shattered. Dark stains marked the dusty ground where Ravenclaw's men had fallen, not dead, but wounded and humiliated before being forced to limp away into the darkness. Only Ramirez had been kept behind, bound securely in the tack room, a living witness to what had transpired. Victor Ravenclaw himself had escaped in the chaos, but not before Eliana had left her mark, a thin, precise cut across his cheek that would scar regardless of whatever expensive cosmetic procedures he might seek. A reminder each time he looked in the mirror that Shadow Valley had teeth. Eliana stood on the ridge above her ranch, watching the sunrise paint the sandstone cliffs in shades of amber and gold. The confrontation had been decisive, but far from final. She had studied predators long enough to know that Ravenclaw would return, wounded pride making him more dangerous than before. He would bring more men, better prepared, expecting resistance. She had perhaps 3 days before they came. Back, 3 days to prepare for a war she hadn't chosen but would not shy away from. The isolation that had once been Shadow Valley's greatest appeal now presented its most significant vulnerability. Help was too distant, communications too unreliable for conventional solutions. Joseph Redbird found her there as the sun cleared. The eastern mountains. The Navajo foreman's weathered face showed no surprise at the scene below, only grim understanding. At 62, Joseph had seen the pattern repeat throughout his life, powerful men taking what wasn't theirs because they believed no one could stop them. "Helena told me what happened," he said, standing beside Eliana on the ridge. "Ravenclaw. We'll bring his whole crew next time." Eliana nodded, her eyes still fixed on the compound. "They'll expect fear. They'll find preparation instead." "The sheriff won't help," Joseph said. "It wasn't a question." "Tanner's been in Ravenclaw's pocket since the election," Eliana confirmed. "And even if he weren't, the nearest honest law enforcement is 2 counties over. We're on our own." Joseph was silent for a long moment, weighing something in his mind. Finally he said, "Not entirely alone. There are those who remember the old alliances between the Blackwood family and the people." Eliana turned to him, one eyebrow raised. The people referred to the loosely connected network of indigenous communities that maintained traditional ways despite centuries of attempted erasure. Her relationship with them had always been complex, an outsider granted rare acceptance. After being taken in by Whitefeather's family following her parents' death, "The tribal council stays out of white men's business," she said cautiously. Joseph's expression remained impassive. "The council, yes, but there are others, hunters, trackers, warriors who follow the old ways, who might see Ravenclaw as a threat to more than just your ranch. His developments have already disturbed 3 sacred sites. His men have harassed young women from the reservation. Some scores wait for the right moment to be settled." The implication hung in the air between them. Indigenous justice operated on different principles, followed different timelines than the legal system that had consistently failed them. If Joseph could reach out to these connections, Eliana would gain allies familiar with the land and skilled In the very arts of silent warfare she had employed the previous night. "I won't bring others into my fight," Eliana said finally. "Sometimes the mountain lion hunts alone," Joseph acknowledged. "But when the wolves threaten the entire valley, even solitary hunters join the pack." Back at the ranch house, Eliana confronted her prisoner. Ramirez sat sullenly in a chair, his wrists and ankles bound, a bandage wrapped around his knife-slashed forearm. Helena had treated his wound, more mercy than he deserved, perhaps, but Eliana wouldn't lower herself to his level. "I want information," Eliana said without preamble. "In exchange, you walk out of here intact." Ramirez sneered. "You're dead, lady. When Victor comes back—" "Victor ran," Eliana cut him off, "left his men bleeding in the dirt while he saved himself. Is that who commands your loyalty?" A flicker of uncertainty crossed Ramirez's face. He'd witnessed firsthand how quickly the power dynamic had shifted, how his boss had abandoned them when the advantage turned. "Look," Eliana continued, her voice level, "I don't care about you. You're following orders. But understand this, when Ravenclaw returns, people will die. He's made that inevitable. The only question is who and how many." She placed a satellite phone on the table beside him. "This calls exactly one number. A federal marshal I know from my time working with the Boundary Commission. Tell him everything. About Ravenclaw's operation, the land grabs, the threats, the bribes to local officials. Do that, and you can walk away from what's coming." Ramirez studied her face, looking for deception. Finding none, he gave a slight nod. "The others won't talk. They're too scared of what he'd do." "Then they've chosen their fate," Eliana replied simply. She untied his hands, leaving the phone within reach. "Make your choice." Outside, Helena was taking inventory of their supplies. The young woman's efficiency reminded Eliana of herself at that age, practical, focused, unafraid of harsh realities. "We have food and water for 2 weeks if we're careful," Helena reported. "Ammunition is limited, 30 rounds for the rifles, 42 for the handguns. Medical supplies are adequate unless we have major injuries." Eliana nodded. "Your grandmother's healing knowledge may prove more valuable than modern medicine. Before this is over, are you certain you want to stay? This isn't your fight." Elena's dark eyes flashed. "Shadow Valley has been my home since I was 8 years old. My father's people have lived in these canyons for thousands of years. The Ravenclaws believe they can take whatever they want, because we're few and they are many." She straightened, the movement emphasizing the turquoise pendant that hung at her throat, a symbol of her heritage and strength. "They're wrong." As the morning progressed, Eliana moved through the ranch with meticulous purpose, assessing vulnerabilities and advantages. Shadow Valley's natural geography provided defensive positions that would have made military strategists envious. The access road wound through a narrow canyon that could be easily monitored and, if necessary, blocked. The three-sided box canyon that enclosed the main compound created natural barriers against approach from most directions. Still, there were weaknesses. The eastern slope, while steep, could be navigated by determined attackers. The ranch's water supply, a deep well supplemented by a series of springs, was partially exposed, and their communications remained limited to the satellite phone and a radio system that worked sporadically in the canyon's confines. By midday, Eliana had retreated to her workshop, a converted barn where she practiced the crafts that connected her to both the indigenous traditions she had learned and her own family's history of self-reliance. Here, amid tools and materials collected over decades, she began preparing for the coming conflict. From a locked chest, she removed items rarely seen by others: a bone-handled skinning knife made from a thunderstorm-felled tree, and a mountain lion's femur, a set of hunting implements designed according to Apache traditions but refined through her own experience. steel arrowheads and perfectly balanced throwing knives she had forged herself during the long, grief-stricken months after Marcus's death. These were not museum pieces or cultural appropriations, but working tools entrusted to her by Whitefeather after years of apprenticeship and proven respect. "The weapon is only as good as the spirit wielding it," the elder had told her. "And your spirit, Sky Woman, is both gentle and terrible, like the land itself." As Helena laid out these implements beside more modern tools, memories surfaced of her first successful mountain lion hunt with only a blade. She had been 29, already an accomplished tracker, but still proving herself to the Apache community that had taken her in. The hunt had lasted 3 days, the confrontation itself less than 2 minutes. She had emerged victorious, but humbled, bearing 4 parallel scars across her back that Whitefeather had treated with traditional medicine while teaching her the songs that honored the fallen predator. "The mountain lion hunts alone but is never lonely," Whitefeather had said while applying a poultice of crushed herbs to her wounds. "It knows itself so completely that solitude is simply another form of communion with the world." That understanding had sustained Helena through many challenges, including the slow, agonizing loss of Marcus to cancer. She had learned that true strength came not from dominating others, but from perfect knowledge of one's own capabilities and limitations. Now, as she sharpened blades and prepared defensive tools based on both indigenous designs and her own innovations, Helena considered what she knew of Victor Ravenclaw. Unlike the mountain lions she had faced, honest predators who killed from necessity rather than greed, Ravenclaw represented a different and more insidious threat. He hunted not for survival, but for power, accumulating wealth and influence. Without purpose beyond their possession, his weakness lay in that very nature. Having never faced true resistance, he relied on intimidation rather than skill. His men followed orders but lacked the conviction that came from defending something genuine. They were accustomed to preying on the vulnerable, not confronting. Equals. By late afternoon, Tomas and Miguel had returned from the north pasture, alerted by Joseph about the situation. The ranch hands, brothers from Sonora who had worked at Shadow Valley for 5 years, immediately volunteered to stay and fight. "This is our home too, Senora Blackwood," Tomas said earnestly. "These Ravenclaw bandits, they are no different from the cartels that drove us from our village. We will not run again." Helena accepted their commitment with solemn gratitude. Both men were skilled horsemen and had proven themselves reliable under pressure during flash floods and wildfire evacuations. Miguel, the younger brother, was also an excellent marksman, a talent that would prove valuable in the days ahead. As dusk approached, Joseph returned from his journey to the nearby reservation. With him came 2 unexpected allies, Gabriel Nighthorse and Lonan Two Rivers, renowned trackers from the indigenous community who had occasionally worked with Helena on search and rescue operations over the years. "We came of our own choice," Gabriel said, before Helena could protest. The man's weathered face revealed little emotion, but his eyes held the steady gaze of someone who made decisions with full awareness of their consequences. Ravenclaw's men desecrated the burial site. At Red Canyon last month, the elders say no action can be taken officially. We disagree. Lonan, younger but equally resolute, added, "We bring words from Whitefeather. She says to remind you that sometimes the hunter must become the mountain itself, patient, unmovable, but ready to shed boulders when the time is right." The message from her old mentor sent a wave of calm certainty through Helena. Whitefeather had known exactly what guidance she would need in this moment, not tactical advice, but a philosophical reminder of her core strength. As darkness fell, the small group gathered in the ranch house's main room, where Helena laid. out maps of Shadow Valley and the surrounding terrain. Using stones and carved wooden markers, she indicated defensive positions, likely approach routes, and contingency plans. Ravenclaw will come with overwhelming force, she explained. At least 15 men, possibly more. They'll expect resistance but not strategy. Their first goal will be to secure the main compound, then destroy or contaminate resources to make the land uninhabitable. Joseph nodded. Standard tactics. Make recovery impossible even if they were somehow forced to retreat. Exactly, Eliana confirmed, which is why we won't defend the buildings, at least not directly. Shadow Valley isn't about structures, it's the land itself, the water sources, the hidden places only we know. She pointed to locations on the map where narrow ravines, hidden caves, and natural features created a complex network invisible to those unfamiliar with the terrain. We'll draw them in, separate them, reduce their advantages of numbers and firepower. Gabriel studied the map with the practiced eye of someone who had tracked both animals and men across difficult terrain. Ambush points here, here, and here, he indicated. Natural choke points, where they'll be channeled if they pursue. Lonan traced a finger along a nearly invisible path that wound through the property. This arroyo provides covered movement between defensive positions. We can appear to retreat, then circle behind them repeatedly. As the planning continued, Helena slipped away to the kitchen, returning with a pot of traditional stew and fresh tortillas. The simple act of sharing food brought a moment of normality amid preparations for conflict. As they ate, conversation shifted briefly from tactics to memories, stories of Shadow Valley's history, of challenges overcome, of the connections that bound each of them to this place and to each other. In that moment, looking at the faces illuminated by lantern light, Eliana realized she had been wrong earlier. She had never truly been alone, even in her most solitary pursuits. The mountain lion might hunt by itself, but it existed within a wider ecosystem of relationships and mutual dependencies. After the meal, they moved outside, standing in the cool night air beneath a vast canopy of stars. Eliana oriented them to night operations, explaining techniques for maintaining night vision, moving silently even through difficult terrain, and communicating without revealing positions. Rest in shifts, she instructed, as they prepared to separate to their assigned positions. Conserve energy and resources. Remember that Ravenclaw's men are used to city rhythms and artificial light. The darkness and silence of the canyon will wear on them in ways they can't anticipate. As the others dispersed, Joseph remained beside Eliana on the porch. "You've been preparing for something like this your whole life, haven't you?" he observed. "Not this specific threat, but a moment when everything you've learned would be tested." Eliana considered his words, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead. "When my parents died in that flood, I lost everything I thought mattered. Home, family, certainty. Whitefeather taught me that loss is just transformation. Everything I learned afterward, tracking, hunting, self-reliance, was about rebuilding myself into someone who couldn't be destroyed by losing external things." She touched the knife at her hip, the same blade that had faced mountain lions and, most recently, drawn blood from those who threatened her home. "Ravenclaw believes he's coming to take something from me," she said quietly. "He doesn't understand that Shadow Valley isn't just property. It's a covenant with the land itself. You don't own places like this, you become their guardian. And guardians don't surrender what they've sworn to protect." The night grew deeper around them, a living darkness filled with the subtle sounds of the desert. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, a lonely, wavering note that hung in the air like a question. As if in answer, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and dust across the valley that 7 people now prepared to defend against those who sought to destroy it. The coming confrontation would be neither simple nor painless. But as Helena finally moved to take her position on the eastern ridge, she felt the absolute clarity that had always accompanied her most dangerous hunts. The division between hunter and prey, friend and enemy, past and future seemed to dissolve, leaving only the perfect awareness of the present moment and what it demanded. Shadow Valley would stand, and those who thought to take it would learn what it meant to awaken a predator who had never been prey. Dawn broke with the hushed anticipation of an indrawn breath. Helena crouched on a rocky outcropping overlooking the eastern approach to Shadow Valley, her body perfectly still despite having maintained her vigil through the night. Sleep was a luxury she had learned to partition into small increments during her hunting years. 15 minutes here, 30 there, always maintaining a level of awareness that bordered on supernatural. The first sign came not as a sound or sight, but as a disturbance in the air itself, a subtle shift in pressure that sensitive desert creatures recognized instinctively. Near her position, a western diamondback rattlesnake, which had been basking on a sun-warmed rock, suddenly slithered for cover. Jackrabbits that had been grazing on sparse vegetation froze, then bounded away in zigzag patterns. Nature's warning system was sounding the alarm. Helena pressed a button on the modified two-way radio clipped to her belt, one short burst, silent but triggering similar units carried by her allies. The signal was simple. Movement detected, eastern approach. Through her field glasses, she watched as a cloud of dust appeared on the horizon. Unlike the previous night's approach, Ravenclaw wasn't attempting stealth. The convoy of vehicles moved with the brash confidence of overwhelming force. Two large black SUVs, followed by a desert-tan Humvee, trailed by 3 dirt bikes that darted ahead like scout insects. Visible count at 15, possibly more concealed, she murmured into the radio. Heavily armed, military-grade equipment, Joseph's voice crackled back. Recognized 2 former Border Patrol agents among his crew. Man in the Humvee turret is Deacon Walsh, dishonorable discharge from Marines, worked as mercenary in South America. The intelligence was troubling but not unexpected. Ravenclaw had escalated exactly as predicted, bringing not just more men, but trained fighters with tactical experience. The convoy halted about 2 miles from the ranch compound just beyond the mouth of the Box Canyon. Through her glasses, Helena could see the men gathering around the Humvee, where Ravenclaw himself stood on the hood, apparently giving instructions. Even at this distance, the bandage on his cheek was visible, a bright white rectangle that would serve as a reminder of his humiliation and a focal point for his rage. His men spread out in a practiced formation that confirmed Joseph's assessment of their background. These weren't the intimidation specialists of his previous visit, but combat-seasoned operatives accustomed to offensive operations. They're splitting into 3 teams, Gabriel reported from his position on the western ridge. Dirt bikes heading for the high ground to establish overwatch. Let them come, Helena responded. Maintain discipline, no engagement until they cross the markers. The markers, small cairns of stacked stones visible only to those who knew to look for them, delineated the boundaries of the first phase of their defense. Beyond those points, Ravenclaw's men would find themselves channeled into predetermined zones where their numbers and firepower would be neutralized by the terrain. The dirt bikes reached the ridge first, their riders dismounting to establish sniper positions with scoped rifles. Helena could have taken them out easily from her hidden vantage point, but remained motionless. Patience had been her first and most important lesson, both as a hunter and as a student of indigenous wisdom. The desert rewarded those who understood its rhythms and punished those who imposed their own. The main force advanced in tactical formation, moving from cover to cover with practiced efficiency. They carried a mix of weapons, semi-automatic, rifles, shotguns, and sidearms, and wore ceramic-plated tactical vests. Ravenclaw himself remained near the vehicles, directing operations via radio, while 2 bodyguards maintained close protection. As the advance team crossed the first marker, "Line!" Helena gave the signal. From 3 different positions, ceramic jars were hurled into the narrow passage ahead of the intruders. The containers shattered on impact, releasing clouds of fine powder into the air, a mixture of habanero peppers, powdered nettles, and an irritant derived from a desert plant known locally as the Devil's Whisper. The effect was immediate and devastating. The lead men staggered, clawing at their eyes and throats as the airborne irritant enveloped them. Training and discipline dissolved under the assault on their respiratory systems. Some fired blindly into the surrounding rocks, while others fell, to their knees, incapacitated by uncontrollable coughing. "What the hell?" Ravenclaw's voice carried across the canyon as he watched his advance team collapse into disarray. "Walsh, get the water cannons! Spray down that whole area!" The Humvee lurched forward, its modified firefighting equipment prepared to neutralize the chemical attack. It was exactly the response Helena had anticipated. As the vehicle reached the affected zone, Lonan triggered the second phase, pulling a hidden release that sent a cascade of boulders tumbling down the canyon wall. The rockslide wasn't aimed directly at the Humvee, but strategically positioned to block its retreat. "They're behind us," one of the men shouted, firing wildly at the ridge, where dust from the rockslide obscured any potential targets. In the confusion, Helena made her move. Dropping silently from her position, she circled behind the disoriented advance team. While they focused on the perceived threat from the ridgeline, she approached the first isolated operative, a muscular man with a military-style haircut who had retreated behind a boulder to radio for instructions. "Bravo, team! I've lost visual on Alpha. Something hit them, some kind of chemical weapon. Request." His transmission died mid-sentence as Helena's arm locked around his throat in a precise chokehold, not to kill, but to render unconscious. The technique, taught to her by an Apache elder who had served as a scout in Vietnam, required perfect pressure application. Too much force would cause permanent damage. Too little would allow the target to sound an alarm. As the man slumped unconscious, Helena relieved him of his radio, weapon, and tactical vest. The radio would provide valuable intelligence on Ravenclaw's communications. The vest she left, its weight and bulk, would only hinder her movement in the terrain she knew by heart. "Southeast quadrant compromised," she reported quietly into her own radio. "One neutralized, securing position." The response from her allies was immediate and coordinated. From multiple hidden positions, they began isolating and neutralizing Ravenclaw's men, using the landscape as their primary weapon. Gabriel triggered a flash flood through a narrow arroyo where 2 operatives had taken cover, washing them nearly 100 yards downstream before they could recover. Helena and Miguel used precisely aimed shots to disable equipment rather than personnel. Communications gear, weapon scopes, night vision devices. Ravenclaw, watching his carefully planned Operation Disintegrate, shifted tactics. "Pull back to defensive positions," he ordered, over the radio network that Helena could now monitor. "Establish a perimeter around the vehicles. Drone team, get me aerial reconnaissance now." The mention of drones represented an unexpected escalation. Helena keyed her radio. "All units, be advised. Possible aerial surveillance incoming. Move to concealed positions. Implement countermeasures." Joseph's response was calm but urgent. "I see it. Commercial quadcopter with thermal imaging capability, launching distraction protocols." Within minutes, small fires erupted at strategic points around the canyon perimeter. Not threatening blazes, but carefully controlled burns, using fuel mixtures that generated intense heat signatures. The drone's thermal imaging would be overwhelmed by these decoy targets, unable to distinguish between the fires and human bodies. By mid-morning, the standoff had evolved into a war of attrition. Ravenclaw's superior numbers and firepower were rendered nearly useless by the defenders' intimate knowledge of the terrain and asymmetric tactics. 3 of his men had been found unconscious, stripped of weapons and communications. Two others were stranded on the far side of the flash-flooded arroyo, effectively removed from the fight without a shot fired directly at them. At the vehicle position, Ravenclaw paced furiously, the bandage on his cheek now stained with sweat and dust. "She's making fools of us," he snarled at Walsh, who was attempting to reorganize their scattered forces. "One woman and a handful of ranch hands shouldn't be able to hold off professionals." "This isn't a standard defensive operation," Walsh replied, his voice tight with professional concern. "They're using indigenous guerrilla tactics adapted to modern equipment. The Apache used these same methods against the U.S. cavalry for decades." Ravenclaw's face darkened. "I don't need a history lesson. I need results. That property is worth millions in development potential, and I want it secured by nightfall." "We need to change approach," Walsh insisted. "Direct confrontation isn't working. Let's pull back, bring in the heavy equipment, bulldoze the entire access road, cut them off completely. They'll have to negotiate when supplies run out." The suggestion had merit from a tactical perspective, but it underestimated both Eliana's preparations and her resolve. From her hidden observation point less than 50 yards from their position, she could read the frustration and growing doubt among Ravenclaw's men. Even the professionals among them were unnerved by facing an enemy they couldn't see or effectively target. As noon approached, bringing with it the punishing heat of the Arizona summer, Eliana implemented the next phase of her strategy. Using the radio taken from Ravenclaw's man, she broadcast on their frequency, "Shadow Valley to Ravenclaw. You've lost 6 men without a single shot fired directly at them. Consider what will happen when the sun sets." The transmission sent Ravenclaw's security team into high alert, scanning frantically for the source while establishing a protective formation around their leader. Ravenclaw himself grabbed a radio, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "Blackwood, you think this is some kind of game? I've got enough men to overrun your entire operation? Yet here you stand," Eliana replied calmly. "Pinned down at the edge of my property, your men dehydrated, disoriented, and demoralized. The nearest medical assistance is 40 minutes away, if the roads were open, which they aren't." She let the implications sink in before continuing. "I've hunted mountain lions with nothing but a knife, animals far more dangerous and intelligent than the men you've brought. But unlike them, I'm giving you one chance to leave. Take your wounded, and go. Shadow Valley isn't for sale, not today, not ever." Ravenclaw's laugh was harsh and brittle. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But this isn't over. I've got resources you can't imagine. This little resistance of yours is just delaying the inevitable." "Perhaps," Eliana acknowledged, "but delay has its own power. While you've been pinned down here, federal agents have been very interested in the evidence my ranch hand Ramirez provided about your operations, particularly the falsified documents you used to claim my mortgage." The sudden silence on the radio confirmed her hit had landed. Ramirez had indeed made the call, trading information for his freedom. Whether federal authorities would act quickly enough to matter remained uncertain, but Ravenclaw couldn't know that. "You're bluffing," he finally responded, but the confidence had leached from his voice. "The Blackwater County Assessor's records show that my mortgage was satisfied 3 years ago," Eliana continued. "The documents you presented were obvious forgeries, and forgery of financial instruments is a federal offense. Your pocket sheriff might look the other way, but the FBI tends to be more thorough." The standoff continued through the blistering afternoon, with Ravenclaw's forces attempting several probing maneuvers that were thwarted before they gained any significant ground. The defenders employed a strategy of controlled withdrawal, appearing to yield territory while actually drawing the attackers deeper into prepared zones of vulnerability. By late afternoon, the tide had definitively turned. Ravenclaw's men were exhausted, dehydrated, and increasingly doubtful of their mission. 3 more had been incapacitated by carefully placed snares and deadfalls, ancient hunting techniques adapted to capture men rather than animals. None had been seriously injured, but all had been disarmed and left bound in a dried streambed where they could be recovered later. As shadows lengthened across the canyon, Helena prepared for what she knew would be Ravenclaw's most desperate and dangerous move. Men like him, accustomed to power and its exercise, became most volatile when that power was threatened. He would not retreat without a final, potentially catastrophic attempt to salvage both his operation and his pride. The attack, when it came, was more personal than tactical. Ravenclaw himself, accompanied by Walsh and his 2 remaining elite operatives, advanced directly toward the ranch compound. They carried incendiary devices, not the simple gasoline canisters of the previous night, but military-grade thermite, charges capable of creating fires that water couldn't extinguish. "If I can't have it, no one will," Ravenclaw muttered, his face set in lines of bitter determination as they approached the main house. "We'll burn it all, salt the earth, make an example that no one forgets." They reached the ranch house without encountering resistance, which should have triggered Walsh's professional suspicion. Instead, the mercenary was focused on rapid deployment of the incendiary devices, placing them at structural weak points while Ravenclaw stood watch. "Charges set," Walsh reported, returning to Ravenclaw's position on the porch. "Remote detonation. Ready on your signal." Ravenclaw surveyed the quiet ranch compound, his expression twisted with malice and frustration. "Light it up," he ordered. "Then we'll find the widow herself. This ends today, one way or another." Walsh raised the detonator, thumb poised over the trigger. Before he could press it, a voice spoke from the shadows of the porch roof above them. "Looking for me?" Helena dropped from her concealed position, landing silently behind them. Before either man could react, her knife flashed in the fading light, slicing through the detonator's wiring. Her second movement was equally precise, the blade coming to rest against Ravenclaw's throat, just above his carotid artery. "Signal your men to stand down," she said, her voice deadly calm, "or we'll discover if you bleed as easily as the mountain lions." Walsh froze, combat instincts warring with the reality of their tactical situation. His hand hovered near his sidearm, but the cold certainty in Helena's eyes told him she would complete her strike before he could draw. "Do as she says," Ravenclaw ordered, attempting to maintain his authority despite the knife at his throat. For now, as Walsh slowly reached for his radio, the sound of approaching helicopters broke the evening stillness, the distinctive thrum of law enforcement aircraft rather than news or civilian models. Spotlights cut through the gathering dusk, illuminating the ranch compound and the frozen tableau on the porch. "Federal agents!" a voice boomed through a loudspeaker. "This is the FBI. All armed individuals, put down your weapons and place your hands above your heads." Ravenclaw's face transformed from rage to disbelief. "You weren't bluffing," he whispered. Genuine shock, replacing his arrogance for perhaps the first time in decades. "I never bluff," Helena replied simply, lowering her knife as federal agents repelled from the helicopters. "The mountain teaches honesty or death. There is no middle ground." As the agents secured Ravenclaw, Walsh, and the remaining operatives, Helena stepped back, watching with the detached interest of a naturalist observing an ecological shift. The predator who had threatened her territory was being removed, not by her hand alone, but by the natural consequences of his own actions. Joseph appeared at her side, his expression revealing neither triumph nor relief, only quiet acknowledgement that this phase of their struggle had ended as it must. Ramirez's testimony opened the door, he explained. Once federal investigators started looking, they found evidence of similar operations in 3 counties. Falsified documents, bribes, intimidation. They were building a case already when we accelerated things. Helena nodded, watching as Ravenclaw was led toward one of the helicopters, his wrists secured behind his back. The man's stunned expression suggested he was still processing how thoroughly his power had been stripped away, how the empire he'd built through fear and corruption had crumbled in a single day. As the helicopters lifted off, carrying Ravenclaw and his core team to face charges that would likely keep them imprisoned for years, Helena turned her attention to Shadow Valley itself. The day's confrontation had left marks, churned earth where vehicles had struggled for traction, scattered equipment abandoned during retreats, the faint residue of smoke from their diversionary fires. But these were surface wounds that the land would quickly heal. The spring rains would wash away the tracks, new growth would cover the disturbed ground, and the eternal cycle of the desert would continue. What mattered was that the deeper threat, the one that would have transformed this valley into concrete and artificial lakes, had been averted. As twilight deepened into true darkness, Helena stood on the ridge above her ranch, listening to the night sounds of the desert resuming their normal patterns. The confrontation had evolved precisely as the mountain lion hunts of her past. Patient tracking, strategic positioning, and finally, the decisive moment when predator and prey exchanged roles. What no one but Joseph understood was that today's victory represented more than the defense of property. It was the fulfillment of a promise she had made to both Marcus and White Feather, that Shadow Valley would remain a place where the old ways and the new could coexist in balance, where the land itself retained its voice amid human ambitions. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, statements to federal authorities, potential legal proceedings, perhaps even media attention as Ravenclaw's criminal enterprise was exposed. But tonight, in the gathering darkness of the desert she had defended, Helena Blackwood allowed herself one moment of complete stillness, the hunter's rest after the chase was done. 3 weeks after the confrontation at Shadow Valley, Helena stood in the sterile hallway of the federal courthouse in Phoenix, watching rain streak the tall windows. The unseasonable downpour had transformed the desert capital into a glistening landscape of reflective surfaces and hurrying pedestrians. Inside, the air conditioning maintained an artificial chill that seemed to concentrate around the metal detectors and security checkpoints. Mrs. Blackwood, a young assistant U.S. attorney, approached, manila folder clutched to her chest. "They're ready for your final statement." Helena nodded, smoothing the unfamiliar fabric of her charcoal pantsuit. The formal attire felt like a costume, a concession to this world of fluorescent lighting and legal procedures that operated by rules far removed from those of the Canyonlands. For nearly a month, she had navigated this terrain as meticulously as she would an unfamiliar hunting ground, learning its paths and pitfalls while building her case against Victor Ravenclaw. The preliminary hearings had already produced results beyond expectations. Faced with evidence from multiple sources, including Ramirez's comprehensive testimony and documentation from Shadow Valley, Ravenclaw's empire had begun to crumble. 3 local officials, including Sheriff Tanner, had been indicted for corruption. Financial investigations had uncovered money laundering operations running through Ravenclaw's development companies. Each revelation had exposed another layer of criminality that had flourished in the regulatory shadows of the southwestern territories. Yet victory had brought unexpected complications. As Helena followed the assistant into the wood-paneled hearing room, she felt the weight of eyes tracking her movement. Not just the federal prosecutors and defense attorneys, but representatives from media outlets who had transformed her defense of Shadow Valley into a symbol of resistance against unchecked development throughout the West. The Mountain Lion Woman, they called her in headlines that grew more sensational with each retelling of the confrontation. The name carried echoes of her past identity that made her profoundly uncomfortable, not because it was inaccurate, but because it transformed private knowledge into public spectacle. Victor Ravenclaw sat at the defense table, the scar on his cheek now, a thin red line visible even from across the room. His expensive suit and practiced composure couldn't disguise the fundamental change in his demeanor. Like many predators who had never experienced defeat, his first taste of true consequence had shattered something essential in his self-perception. The hearing proceeded with the formal rhythm of legal proceedings everywhere. Statements given, evidence presented, arguments made and countered. Helena delivered her testimony with the same calm precision she brought to every serious task, neither embellishing nor minimizing the events at Shadow Valley. When asked about her methods in neutralizing Ravenclaw's men, she described them as traditional defensive techniques adapted to modern circumstances, a phrasing that visibly frustrated the defense attorney seeking to paint her as a vigilante. "And you maintain that at no point did you intend lethal harm to any of the men who entered your property?" the defense counsel asked, his tone suggesting disbelief. "Intent matters in hunting," Helena replied evenly. "I intended to protect my land and remove a threat. Had I intended fatalities, we would be discussing deaths, not injuries." The simple truth of the statement silenced further questioning along that line. When the proceedings concluded for the day, Helena declined the U.S. Attorney's offer of a federal escort back to her hotel. Instead, she slipped out through a service entrance, avoiding the cluster of reporters gathered in the main lobby. The rain had intensified, providing welcome cover as she made her way to a nondescript sedan where Joseph Redbird waited behind the wheel. "How bad?" he asked as she settled into the passenger seat. "Ravenclaw's facing federal charges that will keep him occupied for years," Helena replied, removing the constricting jacket of her suit. "But his organization is proving more resilient than expected. His brother Clayton has stepped in to manage operations from Nevada." Joseph nodded, guiding the car through rain-slicked streets. Helena called from the ranch. "We've had visitors. Survey teams claiming authorization from the Bureau of Land Management. When she asked for documentation, they retreated, but promised to return with proper paperwork." The news confirmed Helena's growing suspicion. Ravenclaw's imprisonment hadn't ended the threat to Shadow Valley, merely transformed it. With their intimidation tactics exposed, the organization was pivoting to bureaucratic warfare, challenging property lines, water rights, and access agreements through regulatory channels. "They're looking for vulnerabilities," she observed. "Legal pressure points where money and influence can still work without crossing into obvious criminality." "The people have seen these tactics before," Joseph replied grimly. "First, they send men with guns. When that fails, they send men with briefcases. Different weapons, same goal." As they left Phoenix behind, the desert landscape gradually emerged. From the rain, the storm clouds retreating toward the western horizon. The transition from urban to wild matched Helena's internal shift. With each mile, she felt herself shedding the constraints of the courtroom and returning to her essential nature. Their route took them not directly back to Shadow Valley, but to a remote trading post near the territorial borders where indigenous communities had gathered for generations. The weathered wooden structure, surrounded by pickup trucks and the occasional horse, represented a different kind of crossroads, one where traditional knowledge and modern realities intersected without surrendering to either completely. Inside, elders from 3 tribal nations had assembled around a scarred wooden table, their faces reflecting both ancestral wisdom and practical experience with contemporary threats. Whitefeather sat among them, her 94 years evident in the deep lines mapping her face, but belied by the sharp clarity of her obsidian eyes. The gathering wasn't a formal tribal council. Those operated through official channels recognized by federal authorities, but rather a traditional consensus-building circle where respected voices could speak freely. Helena and Joseph were welcomed without ceremony, taking their places in the circle as water was poured and traditional greetings exchanged. "The Ravenclaw snake has lost its head, but its body still writhes," Whitefeather observed, when preliminary courtesies had been completed. Now it seeks new ways to devour what it cannot take by force. Helena nodded, accepting the elders' framing of the situation. They're attempting to use land management regulations and water rights challenges, the legal equivalent of a siege, cutting off resources until surrender becomes inevitable. Around the table, heads nodded in grim recognition. Such tactics had been deployed against indigenous lands for generations, using the very legal system, ostensibly designed to protect property rights as a weapon to undermine them. This fight has become bigger than Shadow Valley alone, said Raymond Cloudhorse, a respected legal advocate who had successfully defended tribal water rights in 3 landmark cases. Ravenclaw's organization is targeting 6 other properties along the proposed resort corridor. They're trying to establish legal precedents they can apply sequentially. He spread a map across the table, indicating properties marked with red circles. These landholders don't have your resources or skills, Helena. They're facing coordinated legal challenges designed to bankrupt them through procedural attrition. The implications were clear. While Helena had successfully defended Shadow Valley against direct assault, her neighbors and allies stood to lose everything through paper warfare they were ill-equipped to fight. Victory on her land would become meaningless if the surrounding territory fell under Ravenclaw's control, transforming Shadow Valley into an isolated island in a sea of development. "What do you propose?" she asked, looking not just at Raymond, but at the entire circle. "Alliance," Whitefeather answered simply, "not just of people, but of knowledge. The old ways and the new, working together." The elder's gnarled finger traced connections between the marked properties. Together, these lands form a corridor of their own, one that protects not just homes, but sacred sites, watershed systems, and wildlife migration routes. What Ravenclaw seeks to build would sever ancient connections that sustain both the people and the land itself. For the next 2 hours, the gathering developed a strategy that wove together traditional ecological knowledge, contemporary legal expertise, and the practical skills of people who had defended their homes against both natural disasters and human predation. Raymond would coordinate legal responses, ensuring consistent defense against regulatory challenges. Indigenous knowledge keepers would document the cultural and ecological significance of the threatened areas, establishing protections under historic preservation statutes. Most significantly, they would form a mutual aid network, sharing resources and expertise across properties that had previously operated in isolation. The approach recognized what Helena had learned through both mountain lion hunting and her confrontation with Ravenclaw. No predator, no matter how powerful individually, could overcome coordinated resistance from prey that refused to be isolated and picked off sequentially. As the meeting concluded, Whitefeather beckoned Helena to join her outside. The storm had passed completely, leaving the desert air washed clean and fragrant with creosote and sage. The elder studied the western horizon, where the sun was beginning its descent behind distant mountains. "You hunted the mountain lion with only a knife because you needed to prove something to yourself," she observed, her voice carrying the particular cadence of Apache wisdom teachings. "That you could face the most dangerous predator on its own terms and survive." Helena nodded, unsurprised by the elder's insight into her motivations. "But the lion hunts alone, because that is its nature," Whitefeather continued. "Humans hunt together because that is ours. The strongest hunter still sleeps sometimes. The most vigilant still misses signs. Together, these weaknesses become strengths. Through sharing." The simple truth resonated deeply with what Helena had experienced. Her successful defense of Shadow Valley had come not through solitary prowess, but through the combined efforts of people who valued the land for their own reasons. Joseph's ancestral connection, Elena's future aspirations, Gabriel and Lonan's cultural heritage. "The next hunt will not be with a knife," Whitefeather said, turning to face Helena directly. "It will be with papers and words and meetings. Less blood, perhaps, but no less dangerous. Remember that even these weapons require the hunter's patience and precision." As the elder spoke, a red-tailed hawk circled overhead, its piercing cry carrying across the landscape. Both women paused to observe its flight, a moment of shared recognition that transcended their different backgrounds and experiences. "I understand," Helena said finally. Whitefeather nodded, satisfaction evident in her ancient eyes. "Good. Then Shadow Valley will stand, not alone like a solitary tree that any storm might topple, but as part of a forest where roots intertwine beneath the surface, invisible but unbreakable." As they returned to the trading post, Helena felt a profound shift in her understanding of the struggle ahead. The mountain lion hunter who had defended her territory through solitary skill would need to become something else, a builder of connections, a weaver of alliances that could withstand both brute force and bureaucratic erosion. The transformation would not come easily to someone who had defined herself through self-reliance. But as the hawk had demonstrated, even the most solitary hunters sometimes recognized the wisdom of a broader perspective, one that saw not just the immediate prey, but the entire landscape and its interconnected patterns of survival and resistance. Headquarters of Ravenclaw Development Group occupied the top 3 floors of Phoenix's newest glass and steel tower. From the 47th floor conference room, Clayton Ravenclaw surveyed the sprawling cityscape with the calculating gaze of a man accustomed to reshaping landscapes to his specifications. At 51, Clayton possessed the same ruthless ambition as his imprisoned brother, but wrapped in a more sophisticated package: Ivy League credentials, political connections, and a carefully cultivated public image as a philanthropist. "The injunction against our water rights challenge was denied," announced Caroline Winters, the group's chief legal counsel, as she entered with a leather portfolio. "Judge McAllister has scheduled a full hearing for next Wednesday." Clayton nodded, satisfaction evident in his steel-grey eyes. "And the BLM easement application?" "Advancing through channels," Carolyn confirmed. "We've got 3 senior officials ready to expedite approval once the environmental assessment is complete." "Which will find no significant impact," Clayton added with a thin smile, "given that the firm conducting the assessment is a subsidiary of our holding company." The meeting continued with clinical precision, each element of their campaign against Shadow Valley and the surrounding properties plotted with the same methodical attention to detail that had built the Ravenclaw empire. Unlike Victor's preference for brute force, Clayton's approach leveraged the labyrinthine complexities of regulatory systems, property law, and financial leverage, a strategy that had already forced 2 neighboring ranches into distress sales. "What about the Blackwood woman?" Clayton asked, turning from the window to face the assembled executives. "Has she responded to our latest official communication?" Caroline's expression tightened slightly. "Not directly. But she's filed for expanded water rights protection under the historical use doctrine, citing indigenous agricultural practices dating back centuries on her property." "Clever," Clayton admitted, irritation flickering across his features. "She's adapting faster than expected. There's more," Caroline continued. "She's formed a legal coalition with 5 other holdout properties. They've pooled resources to hire Raymond Cloudhorse's firm for representation." The news elicited a rare display of emotion from Clayton, a sharp, frustrated exhale as he paced the length of the conference table. Cloudhorse represented a significant complication. The indigenous attorney had built his reputation defeating precisely the type of regulatory maneuvers that formed the cornerstone of Clayton's strategy. "We need to accelerate our timeline," he decided, turning to his chief financial officer. "Increase the pressure on all fronts simultaneously." Tax reassessments, access challenges, water testing requirements. I want every property in that coalition under maximum bureaucratic strain within 30 days. As the meeting concluded and his executives filed out, Clayton remained at the window, his reflection superimposed over the desert landscape beyond the glass. 6 weeks of carefully orchestrated legal and regulatory warfare had yielded less progress than expected. The coalition had proven unexpectedly resilient, countering each move with increasingly sophisticated responses that suggested a level of coordination previously unseen among the region's independent landholders. "You underestimate her," said a quiet voice from the doorway. Clayton turned to find Joseph Redbird standing just inside the conference room, his weathered face impassive as security personnel appeared behind him, clearly confused about how he had reached the executive floor unescorted. "Mr. Redbird," Clayton acknowledged with forced cordiality. "I wasn't aware we had an appointment." "We don't," Joseph replied simply. "But I thought you deserved one courtesy your brother never extended, a warning before you walk into a trap." Clayton dismissed the security team with a gesture, curiosity overriding caution. "Please elaborate." "You think you're fighting for land," Joseph said, moving to the conference table where development plans were still displayed on multiple screens. "But you're actually fighting against time, and time is not on your side." Meaning? Meaning that, while you've been filing motions and applications, Helena has been building something more substantial than legal defenses. Joseph touched one of the screens, enlarging a satellite view of the Shadow Valley region. 4 days from now, Interior Department officials will announce a comprehensive cultural resources survey of the entire corridor your development targets. Clayton's expression remained controlled, but his eyes narrowed slightly. Federal surveys don't take years to complete, during which normal development activities continue. Not when the survey area includes 3 newly identified archaeological sites that qualify for emergency protection under the Archaeological Resources Protection Act, Joseph countered. Sites that were documented last month by a joint team from 2 tribal historic preservation offices and the Smithsonian Institution. The implication landed like a physical blow. Emergency archaeological protections could freeze all development activities indefinitely, creating a regulatory shield that even the Ravenclaw Group's considerable influence couldn't easily penetrate. These supposed sites weren't identified in any previous survey, Clayton objected, his composure finally cracking. Joseph's smile was slight but unmistakable. They were always there. But sometimes what remains hidden depends on who's doing the looking and what they want to see. As the significance of this revelation settled over Clayton, Joseph placed a thumb drive on the conference table. "This contains all the documentation, including preliminary findings, and the scheduling order for the official announcement. I thought you might appreciate the opportunity to adjust your investment strategy before your shareholders learn that your billion-dollar development corridor has become a federally protected archaeological district." "Why are you really here?" "Redbird," Clayton demanded, making no move to touch the drive. "If what you're saying is true, you've already won. Gloating seems beneath you." "I'm here because Eliana Blackwood believes in fair fights," Joseph replied. "She doesn't strike opponents who don't see the blow coming, even when they deserve no such consideration." With that, he turned to leave, pausing at the doorway to deliver a final observation. "Your brother never understood that some things cannot be owned, only respected or destroyed. You're smarter than him, but making the same fundamental mistake." After Joseph's departure, Clayton stared at the thumb drive for long minutes before finally plugging it into his laptop. The documents it contained confirmed everything the foreman had claimed. Detailed archaeological surveys, carbon dating results, official correspondence scheduling the emergency designation, even internal emails from the Department of Interior. discussing the unprecedented significance of the findings. Most damning was a comprehensive memorandum detailing how Ravenclaw Development Group's previous environmental and cultural resource assessments had deliberately overlooked indigenous sites, evidence that could trigger not just project delays, but criminal investigations into violations of federal preservation laws. Clayton's carefully constructed strategy, built on leveraging regulatory processes against the Shadow Valley Coalition, had been comprehensively outflanked. While his legal team had filed motions and challenges through official channels, Helena Blackwood had been orchestrating a more fundamental protection, one rooted in federal statutes that even the Ravenclaw Group's political connections couldn't easily circumvent. The realization triggered not just anger, but a reluctant admiration. She had allowed him to invest millions in planning, legal maneuvers, and regulatory navigation, knowing all along that a more absolute barrier was being constructed behind the scenes. Each delay tactic employed by the coalition hadn't been merely defensive, but deliberately designed to provide time for the archaeological survey to reach completion. 3 hours later, Clayton stood in the sprawling living room of his Paradise Valley mansion, a tumbler of single malt whiskey in hand as he studied enlarged photographs of the woman who had systematically dismantled both branches of the Ravenclaw operation. Helena Blackwood's face revealed little, the same composed vigilance, whether she was testifying in federal court or speaking with indigenous elders at a community gathering. "What drives you?" he murmured, searching the images for some insight into his adversary's nature. Victor had dismissed her as a simple widow, defending sentimental property. Clayton had seen her as a lucky amateur who had stumbled into a temporary advantage. Both assessments had proven catastrophically wrong. The intercom chimed, interrupting his contemplation. "Sir, Mr. Walsh is here as requested." Deacon Walsh entered moments later, his military bearing unchanged despite the prosthetic left hand, a souvenir of his confrontation at Shadow Valley. Unlike most of Victor's former associates, Walsh had retained Clayton's confidence through the transition, his tactical expertise still valued despite the failure of the direct assault approach. "You wanted contingency plans?" Walsh said without preamble, placing a secure tablet on the coffee table. Clayton gestured toward the archaeological survey documents spread across his desk. "Our regulatory strategy has been compromised. We need alternatives that circumvent the new protections without triggering federal enforcement actions." Walsh reviewed the materials with professional thoroughness before responding. "The archaeological designation changes the battlefield fundamentally. Direct development is off the table for the foreseeable future." "I'm aware of the obstacles," Clayton replied impatiently. "I need solutions." "There's only one viable path remaining," Walsh said, activating the tablet to display a complex network of corporate entities and financial flows. "Structured disinvestment and controlled devaluation. We can't develop the land, but we can still ensure no one else profits from it either." The strategy he outlined was elegant in its destructive simplicity, a coordinated campaign to undermine the economic viability of the entire region through manipulation of resource prices, selective infrastructure degradation, and targeted economic pressure on supporting industries. The coalition properties would maintain their legal protections, but find themselves stranded in an artificial economic desert, gradually forcing even the most determined holdouts to abandon land that could no longer sustain them. It wasn't development, but scorched earth, a strategy that sacrificed immediate profit for long-term acquisition after the protective designations eventually lapsed or were overturned by more favorable political administrations. Clayton studied the proposal with growing appreciation for its merciless efficiency. This approach required no violations of the archaeological protections, no direct confrontation with federal authorities, just the invisible hand of economic leverage squeezing gradually tighter until resistance became financially impossible. How soon can implementation begin? He asked, already calculating how to present this strategic pivot to his board. Elements are already in position, Walsh replied. Full deployment could commence within 72 hours. Clayton nodded, decision made. Proceed with preliminary measures. I'll secure board approval by tomorrow afternoon. After Walsh departed, Clayton returned to the photographs of Helena Blackwood, seeing them now through a different lens. She had outmaneuvered him in the regulatory arena through unexpected allies and strategic thinking. But the economic battlefield offered no such protections, no indigenous knowledge to invoke, no federal statutes to shelter behind. You protected the land, he told the impassive image. But land without livelihood is just dirt and rock. Let's see if your coalition can survive when the water costs triple and supply chains mysteriously collapse. What Clayton Ravenclaw failed to recognize as he initiated what he believed was an unassailable strategy was the fundamental lesson that both mountain lions and development magnates eventually learned when confronting Helena Blackwood. The trap was always set long before the prey realized they were being hunted. 3 days later, as Clayton presented the disinvestment strategy to his board of directors, federal agents were simultaneously serving warrants at 17 financial institutions across 4 states, freezing assets and seizing records related to a massive money laundering operation that formed the hidden foundation of the Ravenclaw Empire's liquidity. The archaeological survey that had blocked development had been only the visible portion of a much more comprehensive strategy, one that had anticipated Clayton's response and prepared countermeasures that struck not at his tactical approach, but at the financial infrastructure that made any approach possible. The mountain lion hunter had indeed set her trap with patience and precision, understanding that the most dangerous predators required the most carefully prepared snares. Winter descended on Shadow Valley with quiet authority, transforming the rugged landscape into a study of contrasts. Snow blanketed the higher elevations, while the valley floor remained largely untouched, protected by the natural windbreak of surrounding cliffs. The early morning light painted everything in tones of amber and blue as Helena moved along the eastern ridge, her breath visible in the crisp December air. 6 months had passed since Clayton Ravenclaw's arrest on federal money laundering charges. His trial was still months away, delayed by procedural maneuvers and the sheer complexity of the financial crimes that had underpinned the Ravenclaw Empire. The development consortium had collapsed spectacularly, its assets frozen, its investors scrambling to distance themselves from the scandal. What had once seemed an unstoppable force of progress had been revealed as an elaborate criminal enterprise built on fraud, intimidation, and environmental exploitation. Helena paused at a natural overlook, surveying the changes that had taken place across her beloved Shadow Valley. The ranch house remained largely unchanged, its stone walls and timber roof as solid as the day Marcus had completed them 15 years earlier. But around it, subtle transformations had taken root. Near the eastern spring, a cluster of traditional hugans stood in various stages of completion, round earthen structures built according to Navajo principles of harmony with natural surroundings. These would serve as residences for indigenous apprentices participating in the land stewardship program that now occupied a portion of Shadow Valley. To the west, solar arrays glinted in the morning sun, part of a renewable energy initiative developed in partnership with the coalition properties. The system provided power not just for Shadow Valley, but for 3 neighboring ranches, creating an infrastructure independence that no corporate utility could threaten or control. Most significant were the carefully marked areas spread throughout. The property, archaeological sites that had indeed existed, but remained undocumented until the coordinated survey conducted under Whitefeather's guidance. The sites represented not just ancient history, but living cultural heritage, now protected under federal law from the kind of development that would have destroyed them forever. Looking for mountain lions? Helena's voice came from behind her, the young woman's approach as silent as Eliana's own, a testament to the skills she had absorbed over months of intensive training. Eliana smiled without turning, just watching the valley wake up. Helena joined her at the overlook, binoculars hanging around her neck. At 21, Joseph Redbird's daughter had grown into her role as Shadow Valley's assistant manager with remarkable speed, combining her nursing training with newfound expertise in sustainable range management and indigenous agriculture. The university team arrives tomorrow, Helena reminded her. Dr. Whitehorse wants to begin documenting the water management systems before the ground freezes completely. Eliana nodded, making a mental note to prepare the guest quarters. The partnership with the Tribal College's Environmental Science Department represented another layer of the protection strategy that had evolved in the aftermath of the Ravenclaw confrontation. Academic documentation that strengthened legal protections while creating opportunities for indigenous students to conduct field research on their ancestral techniques. "We should finish the north fence repair today," Eliana said, turning from the view. "The storm forecast for Thursday will make it impossible later in the week." As they descended toward the ranch compound, Eliana reflected on how naturally she had adapted to this new phase of Shadow Valley's existence. The transition from solitary defender to community coordinator hadn't been entirely smooth. Her preference for action over discussion sometimes created friction in coalition meetings, and her instinctive self-reliance occasionally resurfaced, when collaborative approaches might have proven more effective. Yet the change felt organic rather than forced, a natural evolution rather than a fundamental transformation. The same skills that had made her an exceptional hunter and tracker, patience, observation, strategic thinking, transferred surprisingly well to the complex challenges of building sustainable alliances and resilient systems. At the main corral, Joseph was already working with 2 young men from the Hopi Reservation who had joined the apprenticeship program. Their hands moved with growing confidence as they repaired tack and prepared horses for the day's work. The intergenerational knowledge transfer happening across Shadow Valley represented exactly the kind of living heritage that White Feather had emphasized in her guidance. "Federal prosecutor called," Joseph informed Eliana as she approached. "They want you to review additional testimony before the grand jury reconvenes next week." Eliana suppressed a sigh. The legal aftermath of the Ravenclaw operation continued. To demand time and attention she would rather devote to the land itself. Yet she recognized the necessity of completing this aspect of the confrontation, ensuring that the threat couldn't simply resurface under new management or corporate identity. "I'll call them this afternoon," she agreed. "But first, we have fences to mend." The day unfolded with the rhythm of purposeful work that had always defined Shadow Valley. Eliana, Helena, and 2 of the apprentices rode to the northern boundary, where seasonal runoff had undermined fence posts critical for keeping cattle contained during winter grazing. The repairs required both physical strength and practical engineering, calculating load distributions, adjusting for soil conditions, anticipating how freeze-thaw cycles would affect stability. As they worked, Eliana found herself naturally shifting between the role of instructor and co-worker, demonstrating techniques while encouraging the younger workers to problem-solve independently. Teaching had never been her ambition, yet she discovered unexpected satisfaction in watching knowledge transfer from her hands to theirs, a different kind of legacy than she had envisioned during her years with Marcus. "You remind me of my grandmother," commented Thomas Honeywell, the older of the 2 apprentices, as they secured the final section of fencing. She doesn't talk much either, but her hands always know what to do. The simple observation carried no judgment, only recognition of a shared quality across cultural and generational lines. Helena accepted it with a nod, understanding the comparison as the genuine compliment it was intended to be. By late afternoon, they had returned to the ranch house, where the aroma of Helena's venison stew filled the kitchen. The evening meal had evolved into a communal gathering that would have seemed foreign to Helena a year earlier. The long oak table, surrounded by ranch hands, apprentices, and occasionally visitors from coalition properties or tribal programs. Tonight, an unexpected guest waited on the porch, FBI Special Agent Diana Reyes, the lead investigator on the Ravenclaw case. Her government-issue SUV was parked discreetly behind the bunkhouse, suggesting a visit of a sensitive nature rather than official business. "Agent Reyes," Helena greeted her, gesturing toward the porch chairs, "you're a long way from Phoenix." "Some news is better delivered in person," Reyes replied, settling into the offered seat. At 42, she carried herself with the contained energy of someone accustomed to navigating dangerous situations through intellect rather than force. The task force completed its analysis of the Ravenclaw financial network yesterday. Helena waited, recognizing the agent's careful approach to significant information. "We've identified the source of the original pressure on your mortgage," Reyes continued. "It wasn't actually Victor Ravenclaw's initiative. The order came from higher in their organization, a silent partner named Edward Chamberlain." The name landed like a physical blow, though Helena's expression remained carefully neutral. Edward. Chamberlain had been Marcus's oncologist during his battle with pancreatic cancer, the doctor who had recommended increasingly expensive experimental treatments, each promising breakthroughs that never materialized. Chamberlain used his medical practice to identify potential acquisition targets, Reyes explained, watching Helena closely. Patients with valuable properties who might face financial distress due to medical expenses. In your case, he deliberately recommended treatments he knew would be ineffective but financially devastating. The calculated cruelty of the strategy momentarily stole Helena's breath. Marcus had endured painful, debilitating procedures that had robbed him of quality of life in his final months, not for valid medical reasons, but as part of a real estate acquisition scheme. "He's being charged?" Helena asked, her voice steady despite the emotional storm beneath. "Multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, and medical ethics violations," Reyes confirmed. "His cooperation is providing evidence against financial backers we wouldn't have identified otherwise. The entire network is unraveling." After the agent departed, Helena remained on the porch long after darkness had enveloped Shadow Valley. The revelation about Chamberlain added a new dimension to her understanding of what she had been fighting. Not just opportunistic developers, but a systematic predation that targeted people at their most vulnerable. Joseph found her there hours later, sitting motionless in the darkness, her stillness reminiscent of her hunting vigils. Wordlessly, he placed a small bundle wrapped in red cloth beside her chair, before retreating respectfully. When Helena finally unwrapped the package, she found a medicine pouch of traditional design, a small leather container adorned with porcupine, quills and beadwork in patterns she recognized from Whitefeather's teachings. Inside was a folded note in the elder's distinctive handwriting, for when the past returns to wound the present. The mountain lion carries scars but does not live in their pain. The simple wisdom penetrated Helena's grief and rage, not dismissing them but placing them in perspective. The Ravenclaw organization and its hidden partners had taken much from her. Marcus's final dignity, years of financial security, the simple peace of an uncontested existence. But they had failed in their ultimate goal. Shadow Valley remained, not just intact, but strengthened through the very opposition intended to destroy it. More importantly, what had begun as one woman's defense of her home had catalyzed something larger, a coalition that protected not just land, but cultural heritage, ecological wisdom, and sustainable lifeways that might otherwise have been lost beneath concrete and artificial lakes. As the first stars appeared overhead, Helena tied the medicine pouch to her belt. Tomorrow would bring university researchers eager to document indigenous water management techniques. Next week would require testimony that might help bring Chamberlain and his co-conspirators to justice. The months ahead held collaborative projects with coalition partners, apprentice training programs, and the ongoing work of stewardship that any ranch demanded. The mountain lion hunter, who had once defined herself through solitary skill, had found her place in a more complex ecosystem of resistance and rebuilding. The knife that had faced predators, both animal and human, now spent more time cleaning roots for traditional medicines than drawing blood. The tracking abilities that had once located mountain lions now helped identify archaeological features and optimal locations for water conservation structures. Yet Helena Blackwood remained fundamentally herself, observant, resolute, precise in action and speech. The confrontation with the Ravenclaw organization hadn't changed her essential nature so much as revealed new applications for the qualities that had always defined her. As she finally rose to join the evening meal inside, Helena glanced once more across the darkened valley that had become so much more than property. Shadow Valley had transformed from a personal sanctuary into a living laboratory for the proposition that different ways of valuing land could not just coexist, but strengthen each other. The mountain lions still roamed the higher ridges, occasionally taking a calf, despite the ranch's precautions. Helena had tracked them several times since the confrontation, not to hunt, but to understand their movements and needs as part of the valley's complex web of life. Like her, they had adapted to changing circumstances without surrendering their essential nature. Some lessons, it seemed, transcended the boundaries between species. The most successful predators and the most effective defenders recognized when to stand alone and when to become part of something larger than themselves. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.